This is a TalkStation original podcast.
On this week's episode of the Paper Boys podcast, I talked to J. Mike Blake of HighSchoolOT. He tells us about his background in journalism and helps us make sense of the state legislation stripping the North Carolina High School Athletic Association of its powers. It all starts right now on the Paper Boys podcast. Hello and welcome to the Paper Boys podcast. I'm JJ Smith. I'm not joined this week by Zach Nally, so we're the Paper Boy podcast. Actually, we are the Paper Boys because we got J. Mike Blake with us, our guest, and he's a Paper Boy, so it is the Paper Boys podcast. I'm joined as always by our faithful producer, Ross Caraway, and as I mentioned earlier, J. Mike Blake is our guest. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, no problem, man. Good to talk to you.
J. Mike is going to help us go over last week's deal with the North Carolina High School Athletic Association and the North Carolina General Assembly. It was quite interesting, to say the least, and I feel like J. Mike is as plugged in to this situation as anybody in the state. Give you a little background on J. Mike. He is an English teacher at Cardinal Gibbons High School and has been for about 5 years now. During that time, he's also worked with HighSchoolOT. That is the high school sports division of WRAL. Before that, he was a grizzled, crunchy newspaper veteran, which are the kind of people that we like. He was with the News and Observer for about 10 years. He was the high school sports editor. He's also worked with the Cary News and the Southwest Wake News, which were owned by the N&O. He has won the North Carolina High School Athletic Association State Media Representative of the Year. He's won enough North Carolina Press Association awards to choke a large mule. He has been the North Carolina Soccer Coaches Association State Media Representative of the Year twice. I think he's the only person to do that, so he knows what he's talking about. J. Mike is also internet famous for the amount of schools that he's been to. What's the number up to now, J. Mike?
255.
He has visited 255 schools covering sports. So he's been there, done that. I did that once when I saw, this is years ago, J. Mike, I think it was like in the 160s or something. I was like, I wonder what my number is. I sat down for like 10 minutes and did it. I was like in the 40s, and I said, I'm never going to do that again because that's pitiful compared to J. Mike's. J. Mike's also known on Twitter. He's got the North Carolina High School Athletic Association Record Watch. He keeps up with everybody in the state, whether they're breaking records or not. He's also, like me, a fan of, he's kind of the fun with logos guy. He keeps up with new schools that are created or consolidated, and they've got new team names and logos and colors. And like me, he's a bit of a snob when it comes to that. I think we've commiserated a number of times on Twitter how we were mad that people had picked a boring name or boring colors. One day when I'm named Sports Czar, it'll be illegal to have any bird names or any cat names from here on out. Those are all, we've capped out on those. J. Mike's also, you had a couple more things in your Twitter bio that I enjoy. What was it, the free throw thing?
Yeah. I'm a record holder in two sports, unofficially. Career free throw percentage, 100%, will never be broken, 2 out of 2. And then also fewest singles victories in tennis, will never be broken, 0 for however many I played.
Nice. And you're a Harnett County native, right?
Right.
Went to Western?
Went to Western Harnett, yep. Okay. And we were 4A at that time, which may explain the difficulties in getting one singles victory in tennis. And we were playing Apex and Green Hope in those schools.
No doubt. Well, tell us a little bit about Harnett County and what it's like growing up there.
It's such a unique place. You're kind of smushed between Fayetteville to the south and Raleigh to the north. They're kind of overlooked. I know growing up, media coverage-wise, there was, you really, on the western side of town, or the county especially, you kind of didn't know who was going to cover you, if anyone, at any given point, even though in my years there, we were 4A. We were pretty good at football and basketball, the sports that typically get coverage. But I remember going to, a gas station on Saturday morning and trying to pay like $1.50 and getting all these different papers, trying to see which one we were in, because we were playing the Triangle schools. We were closer to Fayetteville. We also had Sanford next door that had its own paper, and there was a Harnett County paper too, but they didn't go further out west. There's a high military presence on the western side, especially because where I grew up, I am, as the crow flies, probably like 4 miles from Fort Bragg. But Fort Bragg is massive. It's thousands of acres. So it's more people live closer to Fayetteville, but that started to, as Fort Bragg expanded, you see more growth in the western side of the county. So for me, the walls would shake in my house when the artillery was shooting off, or you could see the planes going real low when they were practicing their jumps, things like that. It's in the Sand Hills, at least my region is, You've got the Cape Fear River going right down the middle. So west and east sometimes feel very divided because there's only 2 bridges that can get kind of bottlenecks to get from one side of the county to the other. And it's one record I don't like that we've got is we're one of the only counties in the state that still does not have a North Carolina High School Athletic Association state championship in any team sport.
Oh.
We've got some individual champs, but I think all the other counties that fit that profile are super tiny in the eastern, upper northeast corner or in the Inner Banks, Outer Banks area. And then there's us, like Harnett County, which has 4 high schools and is as big as those other counties combined. It's just a rough go in athletics. There's not a lot of opportunities. I grew up very rural, like a lot of farmland. One of the things in my Twitter bio is I'm a pine straw expert because my dad and us, my brothers, would kind of deliver pine straw to people's houses and like you would use for landscaping. And it's kind of a rough place, honestly. I really didn't appreciate how rough it was until I went to college at State and saw the Triangle and was more up close. And I was like, wow, no wonder where I grew up, people, some people had different sets of issues and things like that because the rural North Carolina part of me was kind of took place in that setting and growing up and kind of seeing the people, how everyone was growing up around me. And it's a big part of, why I like going out to these other high schools because I went to a school that the only time we were getting a news crew or a paper was something for sports or something bad had happened. So anytime you can be the bearer of good news and you're there for a good reason, the more it helps the kind of the support and morale of that community, which was huge for us because where we were just out in the middle of nowhere. Like Western Harnett High School has the mailing address of Lillington, but it's a good 10 miles to the west of Lillington. No one who lives in Lillington goes to Western. So it's very much a misnomer. You're out there and there's no town, there's no place that's going to put on a parade for you. If you want to be in a Christmas parade or something, you hope that Lillington would invite you, but that's not really your town. I think it's in many ways kind of helped me as going forward as a high school sports journalist. Just also the notion of being playing the metro area schools, being in a rural school, being at a big school, being a starter on a terrible team, which I was in tennis when I only played my senior year. I wish I had played longer because I wasn't too terribly bad at doubles and even singles, even though I didn't win. And then being a bench warmer in basketball, we were won about 18 games every year, but I was one of the last people in when the game was in hand. So seeing all different angles of high school sports on that level, I think really prepared me for the career that I eventually made out of it and still kind of get to do part-time today.
Well, that's cool that it informed your feelings about, small towns. And I know you visited from one end to the next. I know you've been in Carteret County. I think you covered a game at West Carteret, right?
Yeah. I did a nice little double dip there my last year at N&O where Carteret wasn't in our coverage area, but North Lenoir was there for baseball, and then J.H. Rose was there for boys lacrosse. So I got a little highlights of both and I think caught the dramatic end of the baseball game.
Nice.
So I've been to West. I've been to Croatan once recently for a home playoff soccer match, and I have not made it to East yet, but it's on the list for sure.
Nice. And you went to the News and Observer. You after going to NC State, did you take over for Tim Stevens as the high school sports editor?
Yeah, I did. That was I joined, I guess, right out of NC State. I was working at this website that just started called HighSchoolOT. I was one of the first people there with Nick Stevens, and but it was like part-time. I was looking for something full-time, found it at the Cary News, which was owned by the N&O, and then when the N&O kind of, Tim retires, I apply to replace him, and for like a year there, I'm doing basically 3 jobs for the price of one, and then a year after that, they closed down the community newspapers, and then I didn't have to juggle all those things, which was, which was sort of good for me, but really sad because a lot of people lost their jobs, and it's like, here's your promotion. Now you're officially replacing Tim, and I'm like, this is not the way I wanted it to happen. But yeah, and I guess since then they've had a few people who do mostly like recruiting, but they really haven't picked up the high school sports beat since I left. It's kind of faded to the background. of what they do as a paper.
And talk about filling some big shoes of Tim Stevens, the legend, right?
Yeah. It was. Someone told me, like, just get your own shoes. Like, don't try to fill his shoes. Do your own thing. And especially with the changing climate and the challenges that are coming fast and furious with that digital age, I think we did a pretty good job staying a little bit ahead of what was coming next. But it was definitely more difficult, and it was definitely not the same job that he had left behind. But I think we did all right for the 2-3 years that I was able to kind of fill that spot. So.
And you knew when you went into teaching that you still wanted to do some sports journalism.
What's interesting is when I knew I was going into teaching, that last championship I covered in June, which was like Fuquay Varina versus South Mecklenburg in 4A baseball. I did one of those 90s movies at the end of where you just kind of look around and you're like, one last look at the scoreboard and you take a deep breath and get into the car, like one of those soaking it all in things, because I really thought I was done. Like I wasn't covering any stuff anymore. And then when I kind of started to send out word a little bit, I told Nick Stevens, if you need anything, let me know. And then he was like, well, let's sit down and talk. And I was like, well, I don't want to do the same thing I was doing. Like I wanted a little more experience with the camera and doing new skills if I want to do this on the side. And very quickly, even though in my mind I was leaving it behind for good, I was probably retired for 2 weeks, and then I was back in a HighSchoolOT in a different capacity, that can kind of fit my new work schedule. So not as much, nights and things like that, but still enough to kind of scratch that itch, which has been pretty cool.
Hi, folks. Bob Lowry here, and this episode of the Paper Boys Podcast is brought to you by the Carteret County Speedway.
Carteret County Speedway hosts Bluegrass at the Beach October 20th and 21st with performances from Rhonda Vincent and The Rage. Plus the Coastal Ramblers Band, Poe Ramblin' Boys, Lorraine Jordan at Carolina Road, and the Clyde Maddox and Garrett Newton Bluegrass Band. 1- and 2-day passes are available. Save money and get your advance tickets online now. Camp spots are also available. Bluegrass at the Beach October 20th and 21st. More details on Facebook and advance tickets at carteretspeedway.com.
Hi, I'm Ty Roach, and you're listening to the Paper Boys Podcast.
Last week, the North Carolina High School Athletic Association and the North Carolina General Assembly had their names all over the headlines of HighSchoolOT. The head honcho there, guy that J. Mike works with, Nick Stevens, he always covers it about as well as anybody, or better than anybody in the state. And in the early morning hours after midnight on Friday, the House of Representatives passed a bill that would strip the North Carolina High School Athletic Association of much of its authority to independently govern high school sports in the state. And instead, many of the policies and regulations will be set by the State Board of Education and the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. It passed by a 67-43 vote. It's SB 452. It was mostly along party lines. The Senate passed it the next morning by a 43-0 vote. It went to Governor Roy Cooper. He didn't sign it because no matter what he did, whether he vetoed it or didn't sign it or signed it, it was going to become law because of the supermajority in the General Assembly. So it looks like it is a law now, and the North Carolina High School Athletic Association, as far as we know right now, doesn't look like anything it has ever looked like in its 110 years. So, J. Mike, I guess the best place to start is always the beginning. How did we get here?
Well, there's a super long answer that goes way back to the interest of Senator Tom McInnes, who was upset that Anson County had been eliminated from the playoffs, not eligible because they had 3 or more players fighting in a contest with Richmond. Both of those schools, Anson and Richmond, are in McInnes's jurisdiction or district at the time. And Richmond did not miss the playoffs because video evidence, whatever, some other things, not as many, did not hit that 3-player threshold that we apparently now no longer have. So he did make a call, and he said this. I mean, it's on the record. He was talking to Nick a few years ago and said, this is when I, called and, kind of pushed, for this change to happen. And they did not, they refused to do it. And then I started looking into more stuff. And then it kind of became this pet project for 3 senators where you have Vicki Sawyer and Todd Johnson and Tom McInnes kind of looking into things. there's a lot of back and forth. Initially, the first bill was to dissolve the association entirely. And it didn't really have like much of a outline of a replacement. So that bill by itself was pretty substantial. And Nick and I just kind of knew from the jump, like, this is different. Like, we've seen bills get passed before, or bills be proposed that don't go anywhere, or things thrown out there. Like, that's the name, but that happens every year. And then they don't make it out of committee or whatever. This one seemed different from the jump. And then fast forward a little bit, some back and forth. They kind of come to an understanding, okay, here's what we can do. A memorandum of understanding, HB 91, that I think the association wasn't happy with, but I don't think the association was going to be happy with much. But all in all, I looked at the bill and thought, this is a win for the association. Like, it's not, when you start with, you could be dissolved and no longer exist. They were going to have to do a few things differently. The board meetings where they make all the talk about the rule changes the day before they vote on the rule changes, those have to be live streamed. That's been a great change. Having to put their financial information on the website, that's a great change. They should have been doing that all along. So HB 91 comes along, and I think, like, hey, everything's in a good spot. And I can tell the association probably thought everything's hunky-dory. Well, from the comments since then, and Todd Johnson did an interview with Laura Leslie with WRAL, which is part of Capital Broadcasting, just like HighSchoolOT is. He kind of said, it didn't do what we thought it would do, just paraphrasing. And I don't know if that's because the senators thought they were introducing more change to the association than actually was, or they just, were a little bit disappointed in maybe like, oh, well, that didn't, we didn't write this the way we wanted it to. Or if they wrote it a certain way and they didn't realize the association was doing some of those things already. So basically now, the old structure was the State Board of Education could take charge of these things, or they could delegate some of those things like eligibility, transfer rules, academic eligibility back to the association. Well, the State Board, as you might imagine, and kind of what I was thinking at the time, I was like, don't these people have enough to do? Like, this is a busy job. And so they were delegating pretty much everything back to the association. They were just moving right along, but still abiding by, the live, having to live stream the board meeting, having to post the financial information. And apparently that was not what the senators had hoped for. And even though it's on party lines, you don't get the sense, there's not a whole lot of statements out there that shows that this is like a thing the entire Republican caucus wants. It's just these three senators. And there's been one representative, John Bell, who's been very vocal in the past as well. So now what happens, and they've been upset about a few things. For instance, one that really caught my eye, the board gets together. A lot of states are passing NIL laws, probably not because they want to, but because they know it's an inevitability, and they want to get out in front of it and put in their own parameters, which the NCAA did not do. And so in North Carolina, the board did the same thing. They passed it. Well, Vicki Sawyer had tweeted, like, no one's going to tell my kid how to use their name and likeness, and kind of leaned on the state board to shut it down, which was a new thing. The state board could basically nix any rule that they passed within 15 days, which is incredible power, and I thought was kind of what they wanted. Well, of course, the issue with what Vicki Sawyer said is, like, previously your son or daughter cannot do anything with their name, image, and likeness. This rule was going to give them some say in what they could do before they go off to college. So it was the opposite of what she was saying. She said, this was telling me what I can and cannot do, and actually it was saying, like, you can do something now. Right now, everything's off limits, and you can go down the NIL rabbit hole, for a whole show, I think, if you wanted to.
Right.
But basically now, they made it pretty clear that you can't delegate some of this stuff back to the association, including academic eligibility, which is huge, because now if, let's say, we can use Florida as a little bit of a hint of what could come next. Florida, lets homeschool students play for their local high school if they live in that district. I think in North Carolina, that would probably be, I can see that shoe dropping within the next year or two. And I think a lot of people would find support for it. But again, that will not be a decision made by the association board, the principals, the superintendents, and athletic directors who make it up. It'll be a decision coming from the state superintendent. The horror story of Florida is that, if you're at East Carteret and they don't have boys lacrosse, you could play for the West team in boys lacrosse, but come back and play for East in track or basketball. And, because that's been really narrowed down to, if your school doesn't offer it, you have that right to go and do that. You can transfer even though you're academically eligible somewhere else. That's going to create so much headaches for athletic directors, but that's possible now because of the association board doesn't have that authority to say yes or no. It's going to come from the state superintendent. So if they want to do it, they can. Of course, I think there are good arguments to be made about the government having more of a role in high school athletics. But I think the board having no voice is such a quick change, and it kind of seems to have hit the association out of nowhere. And I think there's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding that from both sides about where the other was on some of these issues.
I think we've all, anybody that's covered high school sports long enough in this state, and people who are in it as far as coaches and ADs and maybe even parents, I think we've all got our issues with the North Carolina High School Athletic Association. You're if you've got more than 3 people as a member of organizations, one person's going to have a problem about something. And this is 436, so obviously even if 90% of the people are happy, that 10% represents a pretty good chunk of schools. But I think we all recognize that when it comes to what they do, put it on regionals, put it on state championships, administering the entire association, that they probably know what they're doing, being they've been doing it for 110 years and it's 436 schools. Whereas when these senators and representatives start talking about taking it over in the government, go back to what you said, Jay Mike, don't they have enough going on, and aren't they going to have to know a whole lot to be taking over this association? Yeah,
one other thing that popped up that I think I saw that Senator Johnson mentioned in an interview with Langston Works of the Charlotte Observer, which was a great interview. One thing he brought up was this story in Richlands where, and I did a column on this, where there was a soccer player there who is one of the best students in her class, but education is continuing to change, right? So she's taking this online class here and this one class that's only here for the semester, but they are on like a A-day, B-day schedule, and somebody gave her bad advice or overlooked. Basically, she was ineligible for her sport in the second semester of her senior year, girls soccer. And I said there's a few rules that can be adopted in the future to make sure this doesn't happen, the easiest of which would just make a senior exemption. And Johnson brought that up as like we basically, a senator from that area, tries to get it appealed, and it eventually does get appealed and reversed. And he used that as an example of not being consistent because the board, or the board allowed her to play. Well, I think at that point the board has so much political pressure on it that was the first time I've really seen them reverse themselves when there was no new information provided. I've seen them, accept appeals, deny appeals, and usually the thing is, what new evidence are you providing that shows this, is true? This is the first time there's no new evidence. Now, I'm not saying that she should not have been allowed to play because I think she deserved to play. But when they appealed to the state board. The state board said no because it's a state board rule. And that's another thing. The association sometimes catches heat for things when they're just upholding some state statute or something. So almost all the eligibility things the association does, those are not age limits. Those are not actually association-only rules. You can find them in the handbook, but they're basically copy-pasted over from whatever the Department of Instruction says. And what that allows, basically, if the Department of Instruction updates something, then the association is coming right back the next semester and updating their handbook. But now you could, if there's a state superintendent who's going to have the final say, yay or nay, or a certain board up there, then they may be more easily succumb to the pressures of, well, this lawmaker is asking me to let this person play, or let this one go for our time being. I think that's what throws off a lot of people. and as well as just the sheer number of appeals, because now a parent or a family can appeal, even if the school, the principal and the athletic director are like, hey, this appeal is not going to work because we're clearly, we don't have good standing here. Now you have this board that's going to be created. It's going to be hearing all these appeals. That'll be quite some cumbersome work. You're going to have to be available all the time, because I've seen where the association's board is like hopping on a Zoom call or hopping on a teleconference like the morning of a state championship game to go over something for a player who is ready to play in that state championship game later that day. So this is all of that. I think a lot of coaches and principals are like, well, that's not ideal. We want to be able to go to the board ourselves. We can present the case. We can, say this person should be allowed to play. Here's why. Instead of someone, basically, I don't want to say undercutting, but you kind of feel a little bit like you're left out of the picture. Your opinion doesn't matter if it's just the family can go to it. It's a tough call, because I think a lot of times you also want to say, hey, the family should have that right. But it is like, that is a big change of governance, because what if all of a sudden appeals start getting approved because no one wants to be the bad guy? Whereas if there was one thing, the association board, they were not afraid to be the bad guy if it meant the law is the law, or the letter of the law is the letter of the law. Like, they were going to uphold that thing and try to be as consistent, even if it made people mad, even if some people say they weren't consistent. In my experience, they had been certainly more consistent than the NCAA about their decisions. So that's a big change coming, I think, that most people won't see. It'll be behind the scenes, but it does make the association itself a little bit less relevant in who's eligible, who's not, especially when it comes to those transfer policies, if those go the way that Florida has.
I'm Ryan Kelly.
I'm Lynn Schultz.
And we're the hosts of the Senior Moment podcast.
Each week we bring you conversations with experts right here in our community about the common and uncommon challenges facing our aging population and caregivers.
We discuss the challenges of caring for a loved one with dementia, as well as the importance of health planning, family history, and much more.
Join us every week for Senior Moment, streaming now on Spotify, YouTube, and at CarolinaCoastOnline.com.
Hi, I'm Blake Dodge, and you're listening to the Paper Boys podcast.
Jay, Mike, if you're sitting in the Chapel Hill offices of the North Carolina High School Athletic Association this week and y'all are brainstorming about what could we have done differently to not have this showed up at our front door last week, what do you think some of the ideas they come up with are?
Yeah, there are some things I think you'd look in the mirror and say, nope, if this happens again, we're doing the exact same thing, including the decision to not grant the exception for Anson County for fighting. You feel good about that when you look in the mirror at the end of the day. There are some of these things that the senators brought up, and even Representative John Bell, even though he's kind of, he's mainly the only one in the House that's been vocal about some of these things. The things that they've all brought up have been things that have been festering for years, and I don't think they, in the offices in Chapel Hill, fully understood quite how much distrust there was out there. Now, flip side, in a weird way, I've seen some of the biggest critics of the association come to their defense over this latest bill, which I think, if I'm a senator now, I'm like, whoa, like what happened? I thought everyone was kind of on board, because when the senators started poking around for like, what's up with this endowment money? Why are your total assets listed as more than $40 million? Those are questions people have had for years, and I think the associate was like, look, like our board gets us. We know we're good. We know we're doing the right thing. We don't have to answer all the rumors. But in today's world, you got to be a little bit proactive. And if someone thinks you're in the wrong, you got to make every effort to make sure you're out in front of those things, right? So this creation of a new foundation, assuming they go through with it, to split off the endowment money and for people to, again, have that transparency where they can see how much is going into each part of the endowment. Some of it's even beyond my understanding, where it's like there's some of it they cannot touch. There's some of it they can only touch for this. There's some of it, all of it they cannot use for game, like expenses. They can't use it for booking championship venues. All of that could have been explained in detail before this stuff happened. Some of the frustrations over, parochials and charters, like the closest thing that we've ever come to addressing it, would be this pass realignment formula, which has done pretty good. I mean, as good as is better than nothing, which was, how many years did we just do nothing on that topic?
Right.
So I think sometimes you're kicking yourself over some of these things, but also some of it you realize, like, there's nothing we could have done. One of the things that really stuck out with Senator Johnson's conversation interview with Laura Leslie was, he said, we hadn't really been talking to them. We've been talking to the state board, and the state board's been talking with them. Well, I think in that kind of game of telephone, like, there's been some things lost in translation. Like in Q Tucker, her interview with Nick said, we met this summer and we provided all these documents and we thought things were in a good place. So there have been times where the association thinks the senators have blindsided them out of nowhere, and the senators think that the association has done something, trying to get around something and have all this extra permission. I don't know how much I would, I wasn't privy to this conversation. I wasn't in that room, but I'd wonder if when this first happened, if there wasn't something about, each party rubbing each other the wrong way that led us to where we are as well. So I think it's just those few things, but you also at the same time throw up your hands like, what can we do? Like HB 91 was working fine. They wanted more information about X, Y, and Z. We gave it to them, and it come back with something that's basically more similar to what they were thinking of in the first place, saying no corporate sponsorships. We can't give out grants. We can't give out scholarships. So I think the association is probably also thinking like, well, what was going to change the outcome? They were going to always pass this in some way. They're just kind of saw an opening and attached it to this insurance bill that's kind of just unrelated to high school sports in general, and found a way to kind of get it in and make it law. So I think there's a few things here and there, woulda, coulda, shoulda, and then some things that are like, man, like once this ball got rolling, it was tough to say there was going to be too much of a change in where we are today.
Yeah, I agree with you, J. Mike, 1,000%. I don't think it was a thing where the NCHSA can look at things that they were doing wrong. I think it's more so that they were doing things right. They just weren't telling us how they were doing things right. There was a real lack of transparency with them, don't you think?
And I wrote a column about this when John Bell was speaking up about parochials and charters, and of course his plan was to like move everyone up to the highest class, depending on what county they're in, which was not a good plan in my estimation. But I showed everyone what it looked like. Where you have little 100, person charter school playing 4A football or 4A basketball. Like I've seen good charter schools play, and I know they'd be last place or next last place in a 4A conference. But this is when he came out with that one, it was like, man, like there's definitely some interest here in the association who for years, the irony of it all, for years they did not do anything, and they would tell people like the first time we try to treat schools differently than the state legislature will, you don't want to invite them in. They're going to have to step in and take a role, and who knows what might happen. The irony is they didn't do anything, and it still happened.
Yeah, irony upon irony, right? Right,
and so now you almost have a green light to handle those schools differently, whether it's a multiplier, whether it's a set-aside classification. You have a green light now because the state legislature is kind of on board with some of it, as long as you don't go too overboard. So you got to navigate those waters as well.
Yeah.
But again, like that was something that was not touched for years, and here we are. And no part of that is in this bill that became law, or in HB 91. But it's out there, so who knows? It might be the next thing around the corner.
Right. And it's funny you mentioned, for years people were just banging on the North Carolina High School Athletic Association. They don't do this, they don't do that. They should be better at this. Everybody's critical of the way they handle their business. And then this comes down, and the National Federation of State High School Associations, the North Carolina Athletic Directors Association, the North Carolina Coaches Association, the Greater Raleigh Sports Alliance. Any person with a voice comes out and takes the side of the NCHSA. I think that took us all back a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, it's something like, hey, all that angst for years, like, well, at the same time, like, guys, you kind of create a climate where people thought they could do this. They have great public support. So at the same time, I think it's probably confusing. If I'm a senator right now, I'm kind of confused. I'm like, hey, I thought people were telling me all the time that they didn't trust these folks. We make this, we've done now 2 bills into law And now we're getting blowback. Like, what is going on? I'm trying to make sense of it myself, right? Because that's what we've heard. But again, I think now they're starting to realize, like, there were some things he didn't like. HB 91 grabbed 6 of the biggest issues, and things were continually getting better. Like, I think the foundation to set apart the endowment was a good first step that could have been done years ago. And now, it's kind of too little too late, because this has taken out a big chunk of what the association has power to do.
Yeah. And I think it's a snowball effect too. You had the Anson thing where, they were wanting to make the playoffs and they've been deemed ineligible because of the fighting. And there's other things too. I think COVID obviously plays a part into this, that 21 year where, what was it? They could only allow 25 people in the gyms and stuff. And you got parents who've got seniors that year, and that didn't go over too well either.
Yeah, that's one thing where I think the association took some bullets for folks, and there are a few instances I can go back to where I'm like, even with the Newbern forfeits here lately, Craven County Schools finds them ineligible, reports them, and then the association is like, yep, that means you have to forfeit. Like, it's not the association investigating, right? But what's in the headline? The headline says, like, right, they've been investigating and looking into this. They really haven't. There's always been a kind of that misunderstanding PR problem, and with the COVID year, that was another example where those fan limitations were Governor Roy Cooper, Secretary Mandy Cohen, and some people were like writing these public letters to the Q Tucker to change it. Like, Q Tucker's not going to defy the governor. There's a state legislator you could have probably written during that time who could have made something happen. I think some of them did try to get a few things changed with fan limitations. But yeah, there was a lot of angst from that. And from that one, however, we saw what happens when you don't have access to those stellar championship facilities, right? We had championships in high schools left and right. And people were upset about those. Like, I covered the last state championship, which was basically in July. I think it was July, with for Clemens beating East Surrey baseball in what was 1A, and J.H. Rose was defeating Cox Mill in 3A. And we were at a kind of a not that great community college field, which I think they've gotten some renovations since then. Then we had to go to high school fields because the community college field couldn't handle the water from the day before. And I'm just like, I'm so ready for this year to be done. But there's some coaches who never forgot and really upset. And you can't tell them it was a one-year thing. Like, this isn't what they normally do. But now looking ahead, like, what if that's the norm? That's a scary thought.
Yeah. One of the things this law does is bans corporate sponsors. That's about 1/3 of the budget for the North Carolina High School Athletic Association. So where does that money come from now, and what do state championship venues look like now, J. Mike?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and you really need to figure out a roadmap of how to make up that. I think it's like 35% of the budget that was now gone. It was like $1.4 million gone. That was, a lot of it was used, and sometimes the association operates at a loss. I know that's weird to think of when the endowment is this, but the endowment is different money than the money set aside for operating, which is, again, tough to wrap my head around it. It's not like I've worked with an endowment before, but if they can't get $1.4 million made up, if they can't accept those grants, then you can't book those facilities, or you need to be real judicious about which couple of facilities you're going to book. And I'm guessing that's probably going to go to basketball and football, because you're going to get the biggest, I think number one state in Carolina for football have the biggest invested interest. They want those championships there the most, and they'll make it work. And then for basketball championships, that's probably something where they can't afford not to, because the fan interest is so high. Especially this year, we're going to a Final Four format that I never really thought I would like, but I think it's actually going to be kind of neat the way it works out now. But everything else, baseball, like, now you're asking high schools to host it because you can't make that up. I'm going to talk to a few people and see, like, what some other states do. Is it possible to put this out for a bid and, like, have, the Greensboro Sports, whatever it is, the Raleigh Sports Alliance, these places that are trying to book events and bring that money to their local economy? Is that a model that the association now uses? Because in Tennessee, they package all their spring championships, turn it into a week-long thing, and it'll be in the Chattanooga area one year and maybe in the Nashville area the next. But those teams or those towns or cities are bidding on trying to host it. That may be the way that you go, because and what I've said repeatedly is, I don't think the Senators understand, like, and they seem to think it's going to be an easy fix based on Todd Johnson's interview with Laura Leslie. It's like, oh, well, we've got state institutions. We can work something out that's reasonable. I'm like, it's not. It's easier said than done. Booking facilities is actually really hard, and it's one of the best things about the current association. And this is probably the most visible. When we've talked about a lot on this podcast about all the little things, it's very, getting into the weeds about what this bill does and doesn't do. Most families will never see that, but a lot of families and fans will see, like, the soccer championship going back to a high school field after it's been in this really nice soccer facility for a couple of years, or a softball championship going to some random park, which is what it was before they moved to college facilities around 2012 or so. Then you're going to get people upset, and then the three senators who've been kind of in the center of all this, they're the ones holding that political football, and they get the blowback. Something needs to be remedied because the dates for the 2024 championships are set, but starting in 2024, that's when the association can no longer accept that kind of money. So it's all, I think it's going to be fast approaching what happens. I would not be surprised if at least that first year, it's going to look like that COVID year where almost everything is in high schools, which is unfortunate because I think that's one of the coolest things about what the association does. My gosh, boys golf one year, for maybe more than 1 year that I've been covering it, gets to play at Pinehurst No. 2
right
on a Monday and Tuesday, like a U.S. Open course. They get it booked up for Monday and Tuesday. I'm sure Monday, Tuesday are slow days for Pinehurst No. 2, but that's pretty awesome. And now what random golf facility are we going to next if we can't have it there?
The high schools, that's just an untenable situation. I don't think anybody wants to do that. And we look at the regionals last year in the basketball, how that was that didn't go too well either. And I think it's just
I was at Lee County where people were getting turned away.
Yeah.
I think honestly what happened there is someone got flustered, and you have these tickets on your phone, and people got in who had a screenshot but not a ticket. That's the number one thing that I'm thinking of. But again, like, these are people who work at a school. They're not trying to. They don't experience event like hosting like you get when you're going to Event One staffers at the Greensboro Coliseum. And another thing that happened with the high school ones 2 years ago, there was a lot of blowback in the Charlotte area because you had two Charlotte teams that had to go out to McDowell County to play. Well, why did they go to McDowell County? When the association puts out, like, hey, who wants to host, there weren't too many people biting at the chance to host those championships because that's a stressful thing. I've got to handle your parking on our campus for these fan bases that do not go here. I got to worry about, like, is there going to be damage in our bathrooms? There going to be, like, fan control, people trying to go after the refs because it's like a Final Four game, but now they're much, much closer than they would be if this game was somewhere else. All those things people don't think about. Like, you can tell somebody, hey, you'll keep all the concessions, and they'll still say, not worth it. I don't want to host that kind of event. So in colleges, same thing. You got to pay everybody to clean up, to set up, work, 12-hour, 15-hour, 18-hour days. And they'll say, well, if we're not getting paid X amount, then it's not in our best interest. There's a reason why the Holiday Invitational in Raleigh, which is now at Broughton, there's a reason why it's there, not Reynolds anymore, because about a decade ago, Reynolds was, from what I heard, charging like $30K a day. And that was years ago. Prices only gone up now. And so that these basic economics, and I don't think people really realize sometimes what goes into that. It'd be a real shame if it goes away, but that's why it never made too much sense to me why they continue to pursue the corporate sponsor thing, because it can only backfire. It can't really get much better from anything here. But I think that speaks to the distrust between the two parties that are going back and forth here, the association and the senators.
All right, J. Mike, I'm going to wrap this up by asking you the toughest question of the podcast. What does the future of high school athletics look like in our state?
I think now the election for the superintendent, there are going to be some people, maybe not a huge percentage, some people are going to base their vote based on what they have to say about high school athletics, which will be interesting. Like, now there's a campaign component to it. I see, like, homeschool students being allowed to play as kind of a quick fix, and I don't think that would be super controversial. There's a few things that have happened in legislature towards high school athletics that are not controversial, that get some good support, and I think that one will. But I think, for 1 year, you're going to have to go to high school venues. There'll be some backlash. The association is going to point the finger, and then something maybe gets worked out from thereafter. I don't know if it's going to look like, can they put out bids for these championships and actually, receive money instead of having to pay to rent them, or negotiate in some way. But I think that's where we're going long term. But I think also the transfer thing is going to be looming over everyone's head. What is the state superintendent going to do regarding transfer rules, academic and eligibility rules? Because now you don't have much to say in it. And then the other piece that keeps getting kind of pushed to the side for all this other stuff, the parochial and charter debate. We're at a pretty good spot where a lot of the best performing charter schools in 1A were moved up to 2A. Mostly because they were just big. They were some of the biggest 1As anyway. This has worked out nicely. Like, I don't know, I never thought I'd see Riverside of Williamston in the 1A boys tennis championship, but there they were, and they lost to Elkin, another rural 1A public school. And it's interesting with my background. I teach at a parochial. My kids go to a charter, but I'm from rural North Carolina, so I see all the issues. I see all the sides, and I think there's opportunity for compromise, but I'm not so confident that the compromise won't be a little sticky if people kind of go at this thing without getting a lot of input or just giving the association say, hey, we're giving you the green light. You handle it, but handle it in some way and seeing what comes from that. I think that's maybe like within the next 5 years, some stuff will be kicked up, and I don't think the first draft will be the best draft for what happens. I think it'll be a little bit little messy at first, just based on how the first few suggestions have gone, right? Let's move all the charters up to 4A. Like, wait a second, now we have a 64-team limit, so right. Now you're also pushing back these 2,000 student schools into 3A, or I guess they'll be 6A or whatever in the future, and there's going to be some frustrations raised when the board tries to fix something and can't because there's a state superintendent rule that they can't get changed in time. Yeah. To offset it. That was the unique thing about the board. I honestly felt like the board sometimes would take too long to change things, but they were meeting twice a year, and in hindsight, that gets changed faster than some state board of education things because that's your primary job. So I think it'll be less responsive to the changes and needs of high school sports. I hope I'm wrong on that. I hope something works out where we forget about it all in a couple of years, but I can see a few more battles along the way for sure.
J. Mike, thank you for walking us through what is a complicated situation, as will probably continue to be. We are so appreciative of your time, and there's always plenty to talk about with the North Carolina High School Athletic Association, so we hope to have you back on someday soon.
Absolutely, man. Let me know.